everyone. My name is Molly Oweni. I'm a chemistry student and a fourth year at Harvard University. And today I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my work studying oxygen absorption in ionic liquids. And I'm particularly excited to tell you all about this because part of this work, which I'll point out later, came from my practicum and was discussed a lot with my practicum advisor, Byung-Ju Lee. So broadly, my graduate work has been focused on studying liquids with high gas solubilities, and in particular, I'm interested in studying liquids with high oxygen solubility because there's many applications that actually require liquids that have high oxygen solubilities. As a few examples, we need higher solubilities for things like artificial blood, where if we could replace normal donated blood with a new liquid that has higher solubility, that would be very powerful in applications of trauma and surgery. Similarly, for tissue engineering and cell culture, it's very important to have a liquid that can deliver a lot of oxygen to develop healthy tissues and good cell culture media. And stepping away from the biological side of things, both fuel cells and electrocatalysts often require oxygen. And so having a liquid with a high oxygen solubility would be very powerful for those applications. But in order to address any of these, what we really need to do first is understand what governs solubility and what parts of liquid structure are actually very important in order to understand why certain liquids have high solubilities and others have low solubilities. So to begin discussing that, here I'm showing you a table comparing water, a liquid that we all know and love, to two other solvents, as well as to bulk oxygen, which is the amount of oxygen that you would have just in a standard metal cylinder. And so the oxygen solubility at 25 degrees C and 1 bar, or ambient pressure, for water is very, very low, especially when you compare to the amount of oxygen that is present or would be present in the cylinder. And most solvents, both examples of which I'm showing here, are higher than water, but lower than in bulk oxygen. And there's kind of a lot of discussion about why this trend exists, and it's thought to be potentially due to two parts of liquid structure. The first is cavity work, or how easy it is to actually form an empty space or void within a liquid that is big enough to actually absorb a gas molecule. So if you have low cohesivity, it's easy to form cavities, and then you should have a higher solubility in that liquid. On the other hand, you could also have a liquid that has naturally high free volume, which means that any cavities that form are just naturally very large and don't require very much expansion in order to accommodate gas molecules. And so what my work very broadly, what I'm going to try to tell you about today, has been focused on trying to understand both of these concepts and try to probe and choose liquids that allow us to understand these better. But in order to do any of this, we actually really need a better experimental probe of liquid structure, something that we can point to and say tells us something about what is going on within the liquid. And so to do that, we chose isothermal compressibility. And the reason that we initially chose it is that if you look at the solubilities compared to the compressibilities for the three liquids that I discussed previously, you can see that they're actually very similar. So water has a very low solubility and a very low compressibility, whereas on the other end of the scale, perfluorohexane has a very high solubility and a very high compressibility. And so how can we understand, sort of as a first pass, why compressibility might tell us something about the liquid structure? Well, it turns out compressibility actually tells you something about the density fluctuations within the liquid. Or another way of saying that would be to say that compressibility tells you about the variance in the average number of particles within a given volume. So in picture form, what that looks like is if you have a low compressibility liquid and you want to know how often one particle can move within into and out of a particular volume, the low compressibility liquid will not allow the particles to move within that volume very often. On the other hand, a high compressibility liquid will have a large number of particles that are moving in between two volumes, giving a high variance. And this pictorially gives you more empty space or more potential area for gas molecules to absorb. So as a first pass, we kind of thought this was a place to start. And what we needed to do was to develop a set of liquids that would allow us to kind of probe this more deeply. And so what we did, we decided to go to the highest solubility liquids that we could find perfluorocarbons, which I briefly just mentioned earlier when I mentioned perfluorohexane, which is shown here. And perfluorocarbons have been used before and are well studied as liquids with very high gas solubility. But one problem with them is they're actually a little bit harder to study because they're very volatile or they evaporate very quickly. So for any kind of gas application, that's not ideal because you'll eventually lose all of the thing that's absorbing your gas. And so what we want to do is try to combine some of the aspects of perfluorocarbons with another class of liquids called ionic liquids. These are a bit more funky. Ionic liquids are composed of bulky organic cations and weakly coordinating anions. And the thing that they're known for is being salts that are still liquid at room temperature. And they have very, very low vapor pressures. So what we thought was if we could combine some of the high degree of fluorination of a perfluorocarbon with the low vapor pressure and charge of an ionic liquid, we might be able to develop a new type of liquid that might have higher oxygen solubility and would also allow us to understand what aspects are actually important for determining solubility. So very broadly, our question is basically, what do typical ionic liquids look like? And what do fluorinated ionic liquids look like? And it turns out that typical ionic liquids have actually been studied before. And so here, all I mean is that it's some kind of ionic liquid that's charged but doesn't have a high degree of perfluorination. And this is a classic example shown here. And as it turns out, this liquid here is actually very similar to water in terms of both its solubility and its compressibility. So what this broad work that I'm going to tell you about aimed to do was try to study this row in my table, or the fluorinated ionic liquids. So how high will their solubilities be, and will that be matched by their compressibility? So in order to do this, we need to develop a library of fluorinated ionic liquids and some pairs in order to try to tease out things about structure and degree of fluorination. So the first pair, which I'll talk about a lot more in the future, is this pair, which is exactly analogous except for the high degree of fluorination in this blue structure. We also chose a different type of cation core that has fluorination only in the anion, and it's sort of non-fluorinated pair. These two ionic liquids don't have non-fluorinated pairs, but we thought they would be useful for their very high degree of fluorination and sort of modified structures. And then lastly, these two ionic liquids are sort of our controls that are very typically studied, and a lot is known about them, so we can use them as kind of validation tools. So the very first thing that I did on this project was to actually make these and then measure their oxygen solubilities, because they often hadn't been measured before. And all of that data is summarized here. So what I'm plotting on the y-axis is the oxygen absorption in millimole per liter as a function of pressure. And so what you can see is that in general, the ionic liquids that have no fluorination or very little fluorination, such as this green structure, have very low oxygen absorptions. And as we move up to higher and higher degrees of fluorination, we also get higher and higher solubilities. So for example, this blue structure here has a very fluorinated cation, and the brown structure has a very fluorinated anion, and they both have the highest solubilities that have been measured for oxygen in ionic liquids. So having given this, we wanted to understand sort of why does the fluorination increase the oxygen solubility. We thought this might have happened because it was kind of our goal if introducing perfluorocarbon aspects into ionic liquids. We wanted to understand more of the table that I showed you before. So we filled out the solubility column, but now we want to know more about the compressibility and what that might tell us about the liquid structure. So here's where my practical advisor, Byung-Gyu, came in. And when I was at Argonne working with him, I told him about this project over lunch, and he suggested that I actually do compressibility measurements using SAX, or small angle X-ray scattering. So briefly, a small angle X-ray scattering experiment, you would fill a capillary, a quartz capillary filled with your ionic liquid, and then you would use an incident X-ray through the ionic liquid, and some of the X-rays will scatter off at some angle with some intensity I at some angle Q. And that data looks like this, as intensity as a function of angle in arbitrary units. And this data is for water. And then if your ionic liquid or liquid has no structure on the nanometer length scale, you get something that's very flat here. And what you can actually do is extrapolate this flat region back to 0 scattering angle. And so once you get 0 scattering angle Sachs intensity, you can actually convert that directly to a compressibility. And this was kind of a realization for us. This is something that Byung-do, my advisor, my practicum advisor, knew very well, but wasn't sort of widely known in the ionic liquid field, is that we could measure compressibility very easily using small angle X-ray scattering. So once you measure water, you can adjust all of the other samples and directly measure compressibility. And so as just a quick visual inspection, this is what some of the data looks like. In black, here's the data I showed you before of water, and we're extrapolating out this yellow region. And as you move up in this plot, you're getting increasing compressibilities. So the green ionic liquid that I talked about before has a compressibility that's relatively similar to water, whereas perfluorohexane up here at the top has a very high compressibility. And so right away, you can see that the fluorinated ionic liquid, at least this one, has an intermediate compressibility. And so what does this mean when we look at all of our data together? Now I'm plotting oxygen absorption as a function of compressibility. And you can see we actually have a pretty nice trend going here. So for systems like water and this green ionic liquid, we have very low oxygen solubility as well as low compressibility, whereas liquids like perfluorohexane that I talked about before have very high values. And then our ionic liquids that have a high degree of fluorination here in the middle, such as this blue structure, have intermediate values. And this is really interesting because it tells us that the compressibility and the oxygen absorption are trending with each other, and that something about what the compressibility is reporting on is actually telling us something that's important for solubility. All right, so at this point, we really wanted to be able to study the liquid in more depth. And so to do this, we turned to simulations, molecular dynamics simulations of liquid structure. So we collaborated with another graduate student, Nicola Molinari, and he simulated the compressibility of the ionic liquids. We compared them to the experimental results that we had obtained at Argonne. And we get pretty good agreement, not within error, but relatively close. And especially it does reproduce the trend of the lowest compressibility ionic liquid to the highest. And then Nicola went one step further and actually simulated the void distribution of the ionic liquids. So here, what I'm showing is the relative proportion of voids in each ionic liquid as a function of size. And so the important thing to notice here is that the blue ionic liquid, which has the highest compressibility and the highest oxygen solubility, also has a void distribution that's shifted towards larger voids. What we think this means is that this blue ionic liquid actually does have a larger number of large voids, and that this is very important for affecting the solubility. In other words, these large voids actually allow this liquid to absorb more gas than either of the other two ionic liquids. And so with that, I will end the story there and thank the Mason Group, in particular my advisor, Jared Mason, my collaborators, Nicola and Boris, as well as a huge thanks to my practicum advisor, Byung-do, and his colleague, Xiaobing. And then last but very much not least, thank you to DOE and CSGF for funding me and for allowing me to interact with all of my colleagues here. It's been great fun. And I'm happy to take any questions.